I think for every producer, there's always going to be that one thing that we strive for. There's always going to be that one place that we want to be that's going to make us excited and make us realize that we really had fun with what we're doing. For me, it was this. Last week I posted this video. After I released that video, I had so many questions about one particular riff that was in that video, and it was the one from Nova. This riff in particular took me so long to be able to digest as a producer. Yes, I had a lot of fun with it. It took me a lot of places, and honestly, I'm super excited about how that part came out. But for me, it was also very tricky to ensure that it was going to hit the right way within the mix, while still maintaining its aggression, its characteristics that make this guitar tone what I wanted it to be, which is to have this very modern twist on a classic rock guitar tone. It took me a while to be able to wrap my head around how I was gonna go about mixing this, but after a bit of trial and error, I finally got to a place that I was really excited about. So before we jump into this section of this song, I do want everyone to understand where I come from when it comes to my mix processing and kind of what's going through my mind when I'm creating these parts of these kind of songs. There's a lot of things that are going on in the background that really do lend a hand to the aggression, the clarity, the power. Prior to sending this to the final mix session, I actually passed this through my Warm Audio EQP WA-EQ. I added a little bit of 2K and a little bit of 10K. I think maybe it was about 2 to 2.5 dB. I don't do too much in terms of outboard EQ. A lot of the times I like to do things in the box so I have as much control as possible. So we'll take a listen to how this sounds before we even jump into how I went about processing this section. What you just heard is actually the raw guitar tone. So the first thing that I started noticing was this crazy whistling thing that was going on between 3K and 3.5K, and I finally nailed it with this, one of my favorite plugins that I've been messing with over the last, since it was out. I think it came out last August. It's by Empirical Labs. It's called the Big Freak. The first thing that I started looking at was getting rid of a little bit of that rumble on the low end, so I decided to do a little bit of a high pass at 90 Hz just to clean that low end up so it'd make room for the bass sub on the main bass guitar. The next thing that I went about doing was looking at notching out the 3K to 3.5K region, and that really cleaned it up and made it a little smoother. So the thing I love about this plugin is actually the way that it is really able to add some character to the overall track. That has a lot to do with this finisher portion of this plugin, which adds a little bit of analog saturation that I really like. But for me, it was just about dialing this in to where it wasn't doing too much, just to where you could barely hear it. So just ensuring that I got the high end, the low end, in that 3.25K region dialed in the way that I needed it. So it'd be a great starting place for me to be able to carry on this track. So the next step that I took was actually incorporating a little bit of multi-band compression. And this is something that I've been kind of experimental with over the course of the last year. And this is my favorite multi-band compressor that I use all the time. And I find that this really allows for me to have a whole lot of control. What I do is I usually break these up into bands. And then what I did is I set the threshold of each of these bands to where it would just barely tickle the top of each band. The next step that I took was something that is not unheard of recently, but it's very easy to get carried away with this specific technique, which is using the Oak Sound Soothe 2. Honestly, I probably could have gotten away with not doing anything on this plugin. I probably could have bypassed it and been completely fine, but it was just to ensure to give a little bit more of a soothe to this particular track. The next step that I took is kind of where I get into the experimental side of things. I just kind of play around with different plugins that I've liked over the years, see where they take me, and like I said, there was a bit of trial and error with these plugins, but it was also very straightforward because the source tone that I used for the guitar tones was good enough to where I could have the freedom to experiment with a lot of these plugins, and it didn't really get in the way of the rest of the mix. The next plugin that I used was Renaissance Axe from Waves. It really does like add a really nice character to these tracks that I really enjoy. We'll play this with and without. The next plugin that I'm going to pull up is a plugin that I only had about a month prior to finishing this album in its entirety, but I loved it so much and it brought so much to the table that I kind of didn't want to not have it on my rhythm guitar tracks. And it is the Black Box HG2. This is a really clean and really great plugin that I like to use to bring a little bit more character to my tracks. I don't want to overuse it. So for me, it was just about dialing this in to where I felt that it was going to bring this track to a step further in terms of how it translated in the overall mix. So I brought up Pinto Triode just a touch, brought in a little bit of air, and just shifted the output to where it was matching the output prior to putting this plug-in into the chain, and I'm really happy with the outcome. The next plugin that we look into is actually a plugin that I also got about a month before I even finished this album, but I really liked it. And there was a particular preset that I found that worked really well with these guitar tones. I found that it brought out a little bit of the pick attack. So this particular plugin is the SPC 404 plugin from Mick DSP, and this was something that I saw Greg Wells using back when I was watching some of his videos on Mix with the Masters. And I thought it was really interesting with how he used this. He used it more as a parallel plugin that it really did bring this nice sheen and attack to his tracks. I really enjoyed how it sounded in the grand scheme of things. I really enjoy that. To me, it sounds better. To me, it brings a little bit more life into it. It's all of these things that just add up to this really great sounding track that does contribute to the overall mix. And I really like that personally. So the last and final plugin that I used is the S1 Imager, and just gives it a little bit of width. I barely did anything with that. There wasn't a whole lot of width that I brought to it because I found that I already had a good bit of width in the context of the mix between the pads, the synths, the bass, and the overall drums. I didn't want to do so much to where I shifted the imaging so much that it was beginning to sound phasey. It was just enough to where it brought a little bit more life into it and a little bit more width. So I'll never forget, I was in the final stages of mixing this album, and there were particular sections that I thought that could really hit a little bit harder. For me, it was about bringing in these parallel attributes that I would be able to blend into the main guitar tracks. So I set up a delay, a reverb that would bring a little bit of width, and a reverb that would bring a little bit of length. I found that it just brought this section to a whole new level. So I'll walk you through the delay that I used for this particular section of this song, and it was only for this part of the song. I didn't use it for any other section. It was just so that this part could just hit way harder. I love how it brought this to the next level. It sounds so good to my ear. Almost 99.9% of the time, is the Echo Boy Jr. It's just super easy, it's intuitive, it makes it easier on me so I can get through my mixes a lot quicker, and that's something I would encourage you to do. Find a plugin that works really great for you. So of course the mix is 100% since it's a parallel delay. I used it on the wide mode with a quarter note. The glide is off. I love this plugin because of I think it emulates like a Memory Man, if I'm not mistaken. I may be completely wrong. And I rolled off a little bit of the high end, and it sounds like this on its own. As well as using a little bit of the saturation just to saturate that, so it really tamps the transients of those delays when you engage the saturation on this particular plugin, and it blends in a lot better. Following this, this is something I like to do is when it comes to delays and parallel delays and reverbs, I like to play around with the mid and side selections so that I get a lot cleaner of a delay. So for the delay, I cut everything on the sides at 320 and everything in the mids at 620, and this just gave a little bit more width. And then I just used the gain knob to pull it down 14 dB, just so it blended in further with that track. Next thing that I did was pull in the FabFilter Pro R. It's a super short reverb, but I just blended into taste to where it brings a little bit more life to my tracks. I don't really use it as a tonal control. I don't really use it to do anything outside of just bring a little bit more character to my tracks. This is what that sounds like. And as before, I used the Pro Q3 just to cut the mid and side, and I think it's the identical EQ curves that I used. And the final reverb plugin that I used to get a little bit of length out of my guitar parts was the Valhalla Vintage Verb, and this is one that I use almost exclusively for vocals, for anything that I just want to get a little bit more length. It's a beautiful plugin, and I love the way it sounds, so this is how that sounds on its own. And then with the same EQ curve with the mid and side cuts and the gain down -14 dB. So the guitars without the parallel delay and reverbs, it sounds like this. And with them, it sounds like this. And in the context of the entire mix, it sounds like this.